Our lecture today is on abstract expressionism, and I want to go back a little bit and talk about some categories that we place art into. Now, all art is going to fall into one of three categories: representational, abstract, or non-objective. And we see basically during the modern age, art making this switch from category 1 through category 2, and today we're going to be dealing with category 3, the non-objective art. So first off, representational art is art that resembles the real world. The objects in the artwork appear or look natural. They look like objects we would see from the outside world. For instance, if we took a look at Edward Hopper's Lighthouse at Two Lights, this is a painting that is very representational. We can identify the lighthouse, the house next to it, clouds in the sky, the hillside, plant life and brush on the hillside. Everything really looks as it should be. But in the early 1900s, this guy named Picasso, he starts to mess around with art, and he creates the very first abstract painting. The definition of abstraction is a little dense, so I'm going to read through it, and then I'll tell you what my definition really is. So, officially, abstraction is the rendering of objects in a stylized or simplified way, so while they remain recognizable, their formal or expressive aspects are emphasized. And what this really means is what I've written in the second paragraph. My translation is that we can identify the objects that are in the painting or in the artwork, but they really don't appear in their natural state. We also have to consider abstraction must be derived from something, meaning that we take an object and we metamorphosize it, we change it, we develop it in such a way that we move away from its natural rendering to something that's much more man-made or geometric. And this can also not only include line, but it can also include color. So our very first abstract painting is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. And it's done around 1907, and we can still identify this image as 5 women. But we can look at their bodies and say that these do not look like natural women. So the curvilinear lines have been made more rectilinear, the forms much more geometric, and Picasso is one of the artists who generally mutes the color in his paintings. Now, other artists such as Franz Marc might enhance the color as well and make it very vibrant, but Picasso just does not do this. Now, today we deal with what's called non-objective art, which means that this art makes no reference to the natural world. We can only talk about these artworks through the formal elements: line, shape, and color. Keep in mind that non-objective art is a new term. It's a new classification because this art is fairly new. We really only start to see this art as we get toward the end of World War II. And this is non-objective art. We can't look at this painting and say, yes, this is a car or a house or a person. We don't really see any objects here. It's not figural by any means. All this is paint on a canvas. So Harold Rosenberg wrote that at a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than as a space to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express an object, actual or imagined. And so what this means is that all of a sudden we have a passive painter who is trying to reproduce the world becoming a very active painter in which to apply their paint to a canvas. And the idea also is that these canvases that abstract expressionists use are very, very large. Now, the reason I told you that the term non-objective is a new term is because we associate the term abstract with this group. We call them the abstract expressionists. And that's a little confusing. But the idea is that non-objectivity did not exist back in the day. So this is a term coined much later. They would be called the non-objective expressionists today if they were indeed just producing this type of art. But back in the day, you either had representational or you had abstract art. The time period you should also be aware of is World War II has just come to an end. We're in the time period of basically 1945 to 1952 with a lot of these works I'm going to show you today. The idea of World War II, though, it has totally devastated Europe. So you have a tremendous amount of artists who have immigrated to America, but you also have a tremendous amount of artworks that have come to America for safekeeping. We also see a switch from Paris being in the capital of the art world now to New York. The images below are Marcel Duchamp at the left, who is one of the more famous artists of Dada, and he has moved to New York and eventually comes to Southern California in the 1960s. The painting at the right, Mondrian's composition of red, blue, and yellow, this also has come to America. Not only that, Mondrian has come to America, and you can see him hanging out in front of the Museum of Modern Art during the 1940s. So abstract expressionism is the very first American art movement, and that is tremendously important. We have moved away from European ideas and ideals, and we've created a totally new and unique art. Remember, America did not follow along in terms of European modernism, and now we've basically stepped over them to create this new form of non-objective art. We can also call this group different terms. Most commonly, they're the abstract expressionists. But sometimes they're called the action painters because they have a very vital, active role in creating the work. They do not stand passively in front of the canvas. There's a tremendous amount of movement that they use to create their works. And they're also occasionally called the New York School. Each of these artists had their own unique style or perspective on what they created. Abstract expressionists were all painters, and the canvases were very raw. They were untreated, just like the Fauvist painters, how they created their art. There's no underdrawing or preliminary drawing to the painting. So when we look at previous artworks like Nighthawks by Edward Hopper, we have a basic idea of what Hopper wanted to create, and we can see the development of that in his preliminary drawings or studies. However, what happens with the abstract expressionists is that they believe that their movements, their creation of art, came from their subconscious, very much like the surrealist painters of a few decades before. So their painting was more automatism rather than something that was planned. And because this new art was so challenging, not only for the common viewer like you or I, but also for other critics. So there's this guy, Clement Greenberg, comes up with the language of formalism to be able to talk about these paintings. Because when we look at a painting like by Pollock, for instance, this is something that is, undescribable. What do we say about this? It just looks like paint splatters. And Clement Greenberg goes about assisting us in letting us talking about expressive line and the use of space. Elements like that can be used to describe this painting. And of course, a lot of times with abstract expressionists, it's not so much about the painting itself, but rather about the biography of the artist. And you'll learn about Pollock in our last assignment of the year, which is based on a movie that has been uploaded onto Moodle, rather a documentary. But he lives a very unique life. So Jackson Pollock is someone who is the father of action painting. And you can see that in this image at the left, he's painting on the floor rather than up on a canvas, and how large these canvases are. Here's a Pollock quote: "I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them." Now, with some of the bio that I'll show you on some of the individual artists here, they're not overtly important, but I did want to give you a little bit of background. I'm mostly interested in you identifying how different each of these painters' styles were. So, of course, Jackson Pollock, by far the most important person in this lecture. He's considered the leader of the abstract expressionists. He's considered the father of action painting. And he painted unlike anyone had ever done before. The idea that we're not even using brushes. We're not touching a brush to a canvas to create art. We're literally dripping off of sticks of wood that have been placed into paint. Keep in mind that these paintings are large. As I showed you Rosenberg's statement, he wrote that these are arenas in which to act, and Pollock himself would step around and step into these paintings to complete them. And along with the other artists, he believed that the painting itself manifested itself in the subconscious. Early works by Pollock, when he went to the Art Student League for school, are very common, but we really, like the modern painters of Europe, they knew how to do basic painting and sculpture and such, but their later style is what developed them into the famous artists that they became. The same thing with the American artists. Pollock can draw, can paint, can create sculpture, but here he's known for these drip paintings. And he says that these are very similar to the Indian sand paintings of the American Southwest. And it's also unique to think about how many of these paintings are created on the ground, but are then placed on the wall to be viewed. And Pollock didn't really care for that. He really wanted them viewed the way he created them, which was on the ground, but unfortunately we never see them that way. And these, of course, became very, very famous. Give you an idea, the painting in the back is Autumn Rhythm. It's about 7 feet tall, and it's about 15 feet wide. Willem de Kooning, the second most famous of the abstract expressionists. This is a gentleman who painted with this gigantic 3-foot-long paintbrush. And what he would do is he would paint, and then he would be unhappy with certain sections. He would scrape off the paint, then reapply. He would build layers. There was a textural element to his paintings. Again, an early work before his more famous works. And he really is a true abstract artist. We're still able to see a figure that's present rather than just paint splatters or spaces of paint. With Woman 1, he says that this is just a contemporary way of showing what a woman looks like, not unlike the early fertility goddesses of prehistory or the rising Venus of the Renaissance, and even the way of depicting a pinup model during the 1940s or 50s, that this was just a contemporary way of creating the female figure. And a lot of women took an argument against this painting, saying it was very misogynistic, there was violence toward women even, but he defends his position. As he got older in life, though, he did develop Alzheimer's, dying in the 1990s, I want to say about 1993. And this is one of his later paintings, and you can see how the figure now has been removed, and it's very much a non-objective type of painting. Lee Krasner is Jackson Pollock's wife, and she is really the one that we have to thank for propelling Jackson Pollock's career, putting her career on hold because she knew how important his work was, but Pollock himself had several issues with alcoholism primarily and mental illness. So Lee Krasner was really the rock in his life that if it wasn't for her, I really don't think we would be talking about Pollock at all today, at least not in the important role that he fulfilled. Now, Mark Rothko is another one of those very famous abstract expressionist artists. His paintings go for millions and millions of dollars. There's even a movie that you can watch about his paintings called Rothko's Rooms. And they're very plain in terms of color. These are large paintings, but they're usually only 2 or 3 colors that are present in them. The paintings, he said, were entryways to unknown worlds. There was a certain metaphysical or mythological interest that he had with them. And this is also a professor of art. An early work by Rothko, and then his signature works, selling for millions and millions of dollars. I put a link to a Rothko auction on the Moodle site for you to watch, and you can see what a tremendous amount of excitement and high dollar volume that these paintings get. Now, as we get toward, sadly, the end of his life in the late 1960s, early 1970s, his paintings change. He gets divorced, he loses his home, he moves into his art studio, and his paintings go from something that's very bright to something that's very, very dark. And he will sadly end up committing suicide in his studio. Barnett Newman and his zip paintings. Again, these are very large canvases, but usually with a background color and then a vertical line somewhere throughout them. Here's an idea of how large these paintings are. And besides being a painter, he was also a sculptor and created several of these works, the broken obelisk, to commemorate or memorialize Martin Luther King Jr. Ed Reinhardt. And you can see how very slightly the color changes in both the red and these blue paintings, but he's mostly noted for this painting here, the black paintings. And yes, a museum bought this, and there's people who go and see this painting. And it's a very unique work of art, and a lot of people kind of laugh at it and wonder why the heck would anyone go and see a painting that is done like this. And of course, we can all create this type of a painting. But the idea of the black paintings were really the culmination of Ed Reinhardt's career. What happens is that we become a very active viewer in its sensations. There are subtle changes in the color. It kind of really looks like a tic-tac-toe board when you begin to look at it. There's 9 different squares, there are various shades of black, and not only do we begin to come up with questions like, why would someone do this? So all of a sudden we have a very conceptual activity, but we also have a biological activity with the idea of sight being affected. Adolph Gottlieb, and I just throw this image in just again to show you the idea of how large these paintings are and how many of them are created on the ground. Helen Frankenthaler painted very much like Pollock, and she is or was the last of the abstract expressionists to pass away. She passed away in 2011, and she really lectured all the way up to the end at various colleges and universities about what they were creating. She created what was called basically stain paintings, and as you can see here, the paint itself is a lot different than Pollock's type of paint, where he would have streams of paint sitting on top of the canvas. Here, it's mixed with paint thinner, and it absorbs, so it's much more of a stain, and you get the translocation of the paint as well. Let's see. We talk about the term heroic gesture there in the bottom paragraph, and it really is the idea of Pollock creating the heroic gesture, moving his arms and moving his body around the painting. But with Helen Frankenthaler, we don't really see that so much, the idea that the medium itself is pretty much doing the work. It's being absorbed into the canvas and moving from space to space. Mountains and Sea not only has the elements of staining, but it also has her drawing on them on this work with charcoal. And while the names of the artworks are very representational, the artwork itself is non-objective. And the final artist I want to talk about in this series is Morris Louis. And this is a very unique artist. He was different than the other abstract expressionists because he was from Washington, D.C., rather than up in New York with all the others. He also painted very seclusively in a very small studio at his home where nobody saw him paint, not even his wife. The image that you see here is really a staged image that was used in a magazine. He would also tie sticks to the very edges, the very corners of the canvases, and he would manipulate the canvas very much like a puppeteer would manipulate a marionette. He would also curl the canvas into kind of a funnel or tube and then pour paint right into it and then unfurl it, and this is the type of image that would be created from that. And they're very, very popular. Here you can see he does a series of colors, again with the curled canvas. The largest one he created was Seal, and again, it's kind of like a Frankenthaler painting in a way that the painting is absorbed and there is that idea of movement, but he really lets gravity take hold and create some of this painting. And with this image, this will be the end of our lecture on abstract expressionism.